This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of The Flying Ship, Next Town Over, and You+Me Dream. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and you're listening to two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
And this month, Sean and I are going to take a look at three really interesting webcomics. We're going to begin with Jess Milton's The Flying Ship. After that, we're going to discuss The Next Town Over by Erin Mehlos. Or Mehlos. Is it Mehlos or Mehlos?
That's a good question. I do not know.
It's Mehlos.
I'll go with Mehlos.
Mehlos, okay. And then we're going to wrap up with You+Me Dream by Megan Rose Geddes, better known as Rosalarian. But before we get into this month's discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off at the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off at the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
And we have to, while we're talking about them, mention their sister website, mydigitalcomics.com. If you prefer your comics in electronic format, and why wouldn't you if you're listening to a webcomics podcast, you can get a lot of your favorite titles at mydigitalcomics.com in electronic format. So they've got a lot of the big publishers like Image, Top Cow, Action Lab, Boom Studios, and a whole bunch of others. And all of their titles come in PDF and CBZ format, which means that they are DRM free, which means that you don't have to worry about any weird copyright issues about formats and all that. So definite bonus there. So if you prefer your comics electronically, mydigitalcomics.com.
That's right. That's a great place to get your digital comics, or if you prefer your reading material in print format, discountcomicbookservice.com. Wherever you get your comics, do it through DCB Service or one of its sister companies like mydigitalcomics.com or even instocktrades.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Sean and Derek sent you. How have things been going with you?
Doing pretty well. How about yourself? We've been hit with a snowstorm lately, so as of right now, I think we're up to, 12 or 13, 14 inches over the past 2 to 3 days. So a lot of shoveling and snow blowing and that kind of fun stuff. But otherwise, well. How about yourself?
Oh, doing okay. I had heard about the snow that hit up your way, and not because I've watched the Weather Channel, but I've been in correspondence with, our friend and fellow co-host Gene Cannonberg Jr., and he was telling me a couple of days ago that you were expecting to be hit. So yeah, you have that. Now, I don't know if this will make you feel bad, envious, or what, but today it started off in the lower 60s. It will probably be a high of about, 65, 67 in the Charlotte area. Wow. Yeah, it's a little misty, sometimes a little rainy today, but radically different from the weather that you're having.
Definitely a far piece different. I don't think we've been above 20 degrees for at least a week and a half now, and even our highs over 2018 have barely gotten into the 30s, I think. So Actually, it's actually. I was walking outside yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, and I remember thinking, "Oh, it's only 18 degrees out. That means it's warm enough. I don't need to put on gloves." And I was thinking that's wrong somehow. That should not be. Oh, it's warm enough because it's 18 degrees that I don't need gloves. There's something wrong with that.
Right. Well, you live in Chicagoland. What do you expect?
Well, there is that. Yeah, I can't complain too much. I chose to live here, so.
Well, Sean, let's transition from discussing the outdoors into discussing something that you can easily and in an enjoyable manner do indoors, which is reading webcomics.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the first webcomic for the month that we're going to be discussing is Jess Milton's The Flying Ship. You can find this at Flying Ship Comic. That's one word, flyingshipcomic.com. This is a webcomic that began on June 16th of 2016, and it's currently ongoing. I think the last update was February 8th, so that's just a few days ago.
Yeah, it seems to be a fairly regular update schedule so far for what we've seen. I don't think I noticed anything where there was a hiatus or anything, so...
No, it's not, and I can't remember how often this is updated because it doesn't say anything about the update frequency on the About page. Can you recall how? Yeah,
no, I don't recall noticing dates as I was reading through it, but. It seems to be fairly regular, nonetheless.
Yeah, it does seem to be regular. And so far, we have, with this webcomic, a prologue and one completed chapter, and now we're into the second chapter. How would you describe The Flying Ship?
Well, so far, what we've got is the rulers of the kingdom are basically trying to set up a kind of a classic fairy tale test to give away the hand of the royal highness Sabrina of the Great Zarafan, I think the place is called.
Right.
And so the royal decree he puts out over in the town square says, "Let one who can build a ship that sails through the sky be her betrothed, for only they could be worthy of her." Mm-hmm. And that kind of starts a lot of people going, "Oh my God, how the hell are you going to build a flying ship? That's impossible. You can't build a flying ship." And through a series of, I guess, unusual encounters, for lack of a better description, we have our protagonist comes across a flying ship. And, well, I guess it's kind of built.
Given, yes.
Given or built for her. I don't know how you wanted to say that exactly, but. And then we're off on adventures. Basically where we're at the moment.
Yeah, you mentioned that The Flying Ship has this fairy tale feel to it. One of the things that I didn't realize until I looked at the About page for The Flying Ship, and there's not really much to the About page. It says that this webcomic is based on a Russian fairy tale. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the About page is so brief, I'm going to read it to you in less than a minute. A fantasy webcomic by Jess Milton based on a Russian fairy tale. Set in the mysterious realm of the Zafarian, the story follows disgruntled Dobrynia as she becomes entangled in a web of desire, revenge, and magic. And that's it.
Yeah, it's not a whole lot to go on to start there, but
but it kind of encapsulates a lot of things, and so it does definitely have that. Now, I'm not aware of the Russian fairy tale that this is based on, but it does have that feel to this because you do have a protagonist, Dobrynia, who is an outsider, right? And after the prologue, which I want to talk about in a moment, when we get into that first chapter, we're introduced to Dobrynia, and she is kind of an outsider, rebellious figure, and how she comes upon this flying ship is an encounter with this mysterious older individual, i.e. the wise old man, one evening, and because of the way she treats him, which is, with respect, and giving him, offering food, I think half of a donut that she has left over. She likes donuts. Right. As a reward, this wise old man figure, gives her this flying ship because he's aware of the decree that went out from the ruler, the Tsar, of Zarafan. And so that's where we are with, I guess, her introduction. Now, I think it's in the second chapter, if I'm not mistaken, we're introduced to another figure that seems completely divorced, at least initially, from Dobrynia and her world. And this is a character by the name of Tamil, or Tam for short. And this is a young man who is studying medicine on a floating ship, a floating school, I guess, on the ocean. And I guess they're part of this realm that Dobrynia is a part of as well, that she's attempting to flee. She doesn't like this place, and so that's the reason why she's excited that she now has this flying ship, so she can finally leave, because she's very disgruntled with the land where she's living. And Tamil is on a ship that I think is part of this region, but it's a floating school, I guess. Through various means, Tam ends up being cast out into the ocean, which is where Dobrynia meets him, and that's basically where the last installment, which came out just a few days ago, leaves off. Right.
And what's interesting about Tam, or one of the things that I think is interesting about Tam, is that even though he's at a school, it's a school that is... It's very interesting in that they seem to be they're trying to teach about medicine and medicinal properties of this, that, and the other, but they seem to have totally dismissed an entire category of medicine. Like this is the old ways of how people used to do it, and that's all bunk, and we're not going to even look at that anymore. And Tam, by contrast, as a student, he's like, well, wait, some of this might be valid. Some of this might be interesting. So why can't we at least talk about it? And he's reprimanded repeatedly for, believing in this nonsense and, dismissive of, and the professors are dismissive of that whole side of the science. And so that's how he ends up getting cast off the ship and picked up with Dobrynia, is because he's actually trying to hide these magical items, or supposedly magical items, that are from this old style of medicine. And he's trying to hide those because there's going to be this, locker inspection or whatever. And if he's caught with those, he's going to be expelled from the school. So he's going around trying to hide this stuff, ends up getting thrown off the ship entirely, totally by accident. But I think it's interesting in that we've got this character who's already established as an outsider in a very different way than Dobrynia is.
Right.
He's the guy who's saying, you know what? Okay, yeah, your medicine and what you're teaching me here is cool, but you're ignoring some of this other stuff too. And he's looked at as what's the term? A rebel or a malcontent or whatever. Just for asking these questions.
Exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned that, and Tam's approach, considered radical by his teachers and fellow students, to medicine, because I think this more solidly introduces to us as readers something that was teased in Dobrynia's sections earlier, and that is this larger world conflict between, I guess, what we can call the magicers, or those who believe in kind of a fantastical, magical approach to life, and the realist, right? And so the realm of Zarafan is now ruled by the realist. And we get little bits of information about this past conflict here and there. For instance, in the second chapter, I think it is, right before we're introduced to Tam, and, being in this floating medical school. There's a flashback section where Dobrenia is with her father, who is now dead, but they have just recently moved to Zarafan, and Dobrenia is talking about the Arcanarchists, right? So, Arcania anarchists and Carnarchists, those are the ones who believe in magic. And this is, I guess, at the beginning of this conflict in this flashback between the realist and the magicers, as they're called. And Dobrenia is very anti-Arcanarchists. Okay, it's not the easiest thing to say.
No, it is not.
Yeah, but the father he's a little more worldly. He doesn't necessarily see them as enemies, but he is a mercenary, right? So he says that whoever hires him, whoever pays him to fight, is what he'll fight and why he will fight. Otherwise, he has nothing against the Arcanarchists. So we get some information that there's been some kind of big conflict in the past. And in fact, we even see that when we're, shown Dobrenia for the first time. She's missing a leg. And so she has to wear some kind of prosthetic. And then when we get to, in the second chapter, the character of Tam in his medical studies, he talks about the kind of approach to medicine that the magicers had that are now outlawed by the rulers of Zarafan. And so he sees something in the past of value that makes him a rebel. Ironically, the opposite kind of makes Dobrenia a radical because she's suspicious of the magicers. But we get both of these outsider kind of radical figures coming together right about the time that we're talking now. Again, they've just met by the time this webcomic left off the other day.
And one thing I want to step back for a second here too is when we're discussing when the story here is discussing the Arcanarchists, what I think is particularly interesting is something the father says. Is he hears Dobrenia call them that, and then he stops her and is like, "Oh, so that's what they're calling them now?" As if to say, you know what? They're not a different people. That's just a label that's being politically applied to make them other. And he seems to have, even within the one or two panels there, he seems to have a very real grasp on the political situation that's going on, and that the political enemies of whoever's in power are not necessarily enemies. Mm-hmm. And this is very, going back to that notion that he's more of a pragmatic person, or more of a realist than some of these others, in that he's just, people are people, and what you call them, and you're trying to throw the word anarchy in here, you're trying to throw the word arcane in there, you're clearly picking up on these terms that have negative connotations, and thereby making this person an enemy, mm-hmm. even though they not necessarily are. Exactly. And I think it's a very, within those couple of panels that he's in there, because mm-hmm. Like you said, the character's dead by the time the story starts, so we only get a few panels of him in a flashback. But I think it's a very telling description of the political situation just through those couple of little bits of dialogue.
Right, and that gets back to what I mentioned earlier about this subtext that I think that Milton is weaving in the first couple of chapters of The Flying Ship, which I really appreciate because we're getting bits of information here and there, not in large expository type of chunks, about what had happened in the past and what kind of world this is that we have now. Mm-hmm. And that has me wanting to read on because I'm curious not only about the characters of Dobrenia and Tam, but also what kind of world are they from and what is that world's history and how does that figure into where we see these characters and how their relationship will eventually transpire. So I think there's a lot going on in The Flying Ship. Even as relatively short as it is, again, we're only a prologue and not quite 2 chapters in.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot in there, a lot to talk about, I think. One of the things, I'm certainly interested to see where this is going, and I'm actually curious enough. I haven't yet, but I'm tempted to try and track down what this original fairy tale is, just so I can figure out where it's going, because I'm interested. I think there's a lot to this, and I think Jess is going to put a lot into it going forward. And I think probably expanding on the fairy tale, I would guess, just because fairy tales tend to be fairly short. But I think there's a lot there.
Right. Now, the flying ship part probably has something to do with this original Russian fairy tale. But I think what's much more fairy tale-like is embedded in the prologue, which I want to talk a bit about, because in many ways the prologue stands out because there's an abrupt shift between what we get in the prologue and then the first chapter where we're introduced to Dobrynia and her situation. But in this prologue, and I'm trusting Milton here to be doing something that will become very significant later on in the story. I really don't see it in the first, at least of the first two chapters that we have so far. But again, it'll probably come into play later. And in the prologue, basically what we have is this realm, Zarafan, that has its ruler, which is a czar, again, kind of a Russian label, and has three sons. The czar has three sons. The czar says, who will take over from me will be the son who can shoot an arrow the furthest, right? And so each son has a distinguishing characteristic. One may be a little more clever than the other, another is more loved by the citizens, so on and so forth. And all three of them at one point have this contest. They engage in this contest to see how far they can shoot an arrow. Now, the youngest son actually wins, but he goes missing through certain means. Read the webcomic and you'll find out how and why, or at least you'll find out how. There's still not much of an answer as to why he got lost. And the oldest son then becomes the ruler once the father, the czar, dies. But then the younger son, the youngest of the three sons, comes back, wreaks havoc, and it kind of disrupts the kingdom. It's probably an understatement.
I was going to say.
Yeah, and that's basically where we leave off with the prologue, and then we get chapter 1. We're introduced to Dobrynia. She gets her flying ship, so on and so forth. So I'm curious to see where this beginning part, right, the czar and his three sons, and who has the power, jealousy, ambition, all of that stuff will come into play later.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those things where you get the sense, or at least I got the sense, that this is going to tie in, but probably not till the back half of the story at some point.
Or once we get at least several chapters in.
Yeah, and you're like, it's going to be one of those, you start reading in some of this other stuff, and then you're like, oh, yeah, this ties back to way back into the prologue. It's like you said, we're still early enough in it. It hasn't really connected yet. I don't think it should at this point, not necessarily. Other than just being background prologue, which is what it is. The one thing I will throw out there too, for people who are sitting down to read that and start right at chapter 1 and don't look at anything else first, the prologue is written basically as a fairy tale, right, in that it's essentially illustrated prose. And there's very little dialogue or interaction that looks like a comic book. It really does look and read like illustrated prose. But once we get to the end of the prologue, then Milton goes on to just basically treating it as a comic from that point forward. So if anybody sits down to start reading it and says, "Wait a minute, this isn't really even a comic," it is, just not in the prologue.
Right. In fact, looking in the archive, and by the way, that's one of the things we do on the Webcomic Show. We look at the various features that this webcomic provides. such as archives. And is the archive thorough? Is it navigable? I do like the archive of The Flying Ship. And so if you look at the archive of the prologue, you get little thumbnails. They're only, I think, 2 pages in the prologue that is comic-ish. In other words, you have panels with word balloons. But other than that, all the other pages look as you described. They look like something, I guess, from something that could be like a picture book, right? A kid's picture book, where it's prose that's illustrated. But there are a couple, arguably 3 pages that do have a more comic book feel with the word balloons and everything. But after that, you're right. After the prologue, then you do get into a feel of the webcomic that it is a webcomic, right? This isn't just illustrated prose.
Yeah. And since you brought up the archive, it's an interesting approach. I don't think I've seen someone do this in quite this format before. Basically, what Milton's done is there's a series of thumbnails of the entire strip to date. And each one, fairly small. It's a thumbnail. And you can click on any one of them and go right to that page. My initial concern would be, okay, that's fine for, 2 chapters and a prologue. That might get unwieldy somewhere around chapter 10, However, there's also at the very top is just a simple drop down with where you can select the chapter that you're interested in and jump right to the beginning of that chapter if you want to go right to chapter 1 or 2 or whatever.
Right, and you have the thumbnails for only those chapters, right? So if you go to, let's say, the prologue or chapter 1, you get thumbnails of only the panels or the pages that make up the prologue or chapter 1, depending on where you go. My guess is, and I was wondering the same thing you were, right? Once you get many chapters into this webcomic, having the initial archive page give you a thumbnail of everything to date may be a little unwieldy. I would guess that as she goes along, Jess Milton will limit what you see in the archive first by chapter, and then depending on what chapter you go to, then you get the thumbnails.
Mm-hmm. It's a nice. I do like though that I do like that you do get those thumbnails though, because they're big enough that you can kind of quickly see, oh yeah, that was the last page I remember reading, and can click on that if you're not able to sit down and do it all in one go. There's a lot of them I've seen. They'll either list it all by date or, just you only can maybe jump to a chapter title or something like that. And I like that this gives you that visual reference of, zooming in directly to, oh yeah, I remember that page layout, so I can click right there and go to that, even though I don't remember if it was I read last week's or 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or whatever.
Right. So yeah, I mean, the archive as it is now, I think is very useful. But we don't have much to this website, I guess, other than the webcomic and the archive. Like we mentioned earlier, there's a relatively short, probably even truncated about page. I mean, it may tell you enough about it. If you want to find out about the creator, Jess Milton, there is a hyperlink on the About page to her name. And if you click that, then you go to her website, jessmilton.com. And that will eventually take you to other pages that you'd go to find out more about her. And I mention that because if you like The Flying Ship and you like Milton's art and you're at flyingshipcomic.com and you want to see if there's merchandise you can buy, right? Print versions of what you just read or T-shirts or coffee mugs or whatever. If you click on shop on flyingshipcomic.com, you get a broken link to Big Cartel, which is something that she should probably fix. If you go to her home website, jessmilton.com, and click on shop, then you go to a Big Cartel site that actually does work.
I did not follow that many links. I will kudos for picking that out. I would have missed that.
But yeah, I wasn't familiar with Milton's work before this. Had you encountered her before?
No, not at all.
She apparently has other comics that she's done, and I think some of these may be other webcomics, although some may be in print. Other titles include Love, Luck, and Ideas, Kentish Town, Canary Girls, and When Shall We 3. These seem to be, from what I can gather from her jessmilton.com website, relatively short comics, maybe webcomic or otherwise. We're not given the entire comic. We're given, let's say, from her main webpage, a taste of it. And then in the cases where you want to read more of, let's say, a webcomic, then you can, I think, click through and read more of that. But yeah, like you, my first exposure to Milton is The Flying Ship.
And I will say, though, it's not a bad first exposure. Certainly.
No, I tell you, I really like what I see. And another thing we haven't really mentioned at all yet, but I find fascinating because it caused me to do a double take at first because it wasn't something that I expected. And that is, you mentioned in the setup of the Flying Ship that Dobrynia sees this announcement from the Tsar, the current Tsar, that says that his daughter, actually, I guess it's his niece, right? From what we learn in the prologue.
Yeah, I think so.
Will win the hand of that individual who builds a flying ship, right? So if this is a classic fairy tale, if it's a princess, then of course it's going to be, if not a prince, then a male who is going to win her hand. And when Dobrynia is mentioned as a possibility to win the hand of the princess, that was where the double take came in. It's like, did I miss something? Is Dobrynia actually a young boy or a young man instead of a young girl? But no, she's female, which I think is an interesting twist, but it's one that Milton doesn't really shove in your face, right?
Right.
And in fact, I think, The Flying Ship is not the only webcomic that we're discussing today that brings up, at least potentially brings up, issues of gender and sexuality, or sexual orientation, I guess. But it's much more in the background with The Flying Ship than it is, let's say, with You+Me Dream.
Or actually, and I don't know if you caught this, there's actually a moment like that in Next Town Over, which we'll be discussing too.
I hadn't, but we can talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But I do like the fact that Milton, if she is basing The Flying Ship on a Russian fairy tale, she's giving it a unique and contemporary twist, which I appreciate.
Well, that's the question I had with it, though, is I wonder, because I'm so unfamiliar with Russian fairy tales, was that actually in the original fairy tale? Maybe it was.
Okay, I would guess not, but who knows? I mean,
I'm just, as we're sitting here from a 21st century perspective, thinking, that a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the news today about the LGBTQ community are new, but in other cultures, those are not necessarily new. They were talked about differently. But those were there. So I don't know enough about Russian culture and Russian history, Russian folklore to know if that was something that would be in there or not. But I'm curious enough to try and track that down and try and figure that out.
Yeah, who knows? It may be something with kind of a Mulan-like twist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Sean, you had mentioned Next Town Over, so do you want to move on to the next webcomic over?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a perfect segue.
Yes. The next webcomic that Sean and I are discussing this month is Erin Melos's, or Mehlos. Again, I'm not sure how you pronounce the last name. And if you're listening to this, Erin, get in touch with us and let us know if we were correct. Next Town Over. You can find this at Next Town Over. That's one word, NEXTTOWNOVER.net. And this started in October of 2010, and it's currently ongoing. In fact, the last update was today, the 11th of February, as we're recording this.
Oh, shoot. I'm behind then because I have not read that yet.
Well, the last update, the most recent update, is a storyline that Mehlos has not created, and I want to talk about that phenomena. It's something that we've mentioned in the past when we talk about certain webcomics, that the creator intersperses her or his story or the main storyline with fan art or fan-based stories. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it can be a little disruptive. But I want to talk about that later. Let's go ahead and introduce what Next Town Over is all about.
Sure. So our protagonist here is a man by the name of John Henry Hunter. And he's a magician performer in what appears to be the American West, although it is very clear in the About page that it is not the historical American West. So he's a stage magician, a performer, an illusionist, does a lot of traveling, gives shows, etc., etc. But he also uses his talents for less honorable purposes, doing some card sharking, some sleight of hand to, pickpockets, that kind of thing. And as well, he's also apparently a very adept sorcerer with the what you might call the dark arts or the magical arts or something along those lines. So he can perform a card trick and can perform your typical illusions, but also can conjure up demon horses as well, although he doesn't do that in his shows, apparently. And so he's going around the West, what appears to be the American West, trying to ply his trade, trying to get it by. But in the background, the entire time, he's being pursued by a character named Vane Black. And she is, or was, I suppose, a former lover of his at some point.
From what we can gather.
From what we can gather, they did have a relationship of some sort. And she is trying to apparently get revenge on him for some slight of some major slight, I suppose, in the past. that has not yet been explained yet. So she's going around essentially trying to kill him or take revenge on him. The interesting twist being that she is a phenomenal mechanical engineer, to the point of taking a horse that has been shot and is dying and creating into a kind of a steampunk horse. Right. That literally runs on steam and half of it's mechanical. And then there's this also twist that has not yet been explained, but she is apparently a member of the undead now. It's not exactly clear what happened or what kind of undead she is, but there's frequent comments about her deathly appearance, and she looks very pale and sickly and etc. And at one point they even say there's a machine that runs off of life energy, to which she responds, well, I can't work with it then. Or I can't operate it or something to that effect. So most of the story has been this game of cat and mouse between John Henry Hunter and Vane Black as they're going through the American West. And he's trying to just survive and get by and do his thing. And she pursues him. She pursues him and very single-mindedly pursues him. Pretty much.
And the way that the chapters are arranged, and right now we're into, or they're called books instead of chapters. We're just into book 9, which is called Via Dolorosa. Every book has a town's name. And so we begin in a town called Lookback. And then after that, John Henry Hunter flees to Sun Prairie, of course, followed by Vane Black. And then and that's what the second book is called, Sun Prairie. And then after that, they go to Whiskey Bend, Book 3, Barron's Crossing, Book 4, Wayward, Book 5, Red Ridge Express, Book 6, Broken Sky, Book 7, Diamondback Ridge, Book 8, and then the most recent Book 9, Via Dolorosa. So literally the way that the webcomic is structured is via the next town over.
Right, and there's actually even a few references that it's not just a random town and we're picking up a year later or something like that. There's very clear references that one character is, oh, hey, I'm going to next town.
Yeah.
And then drops the name of Diamondback Ridge or whatever.
Right. There's that. And it's not as if these individual books or towns, if you will, are completely divorced one from the other. I mean, they're connected in ways that you had mentioned, where one character mentions something about going to the next town over, which will eventually be the next town that they go to, or the title of the next book or chapter, if you want to call it that, in this webcomic. But there are also certain characters and also situations that, to greater or lesser degrees, depending, kind of link one of the books or towns to another. For instance, there are a couple of brothers, Marcus and Lawrence, that we're introduced to. I think it's in book 2, in the Sun Prairie chapter, and they make appearances in some subsequent chapters, definitely in book 3, Whiskey Bend, but they also appear later on. There's another character, Veronique Dauterive, and she does have this kind of exotic, almost French-sounding name, that we see in the very first book, Look Back, and then we don't see her again until I think it is Broken Sky, perhaps?
Yeah, it was very much later, like book 7 or 8. I
had to go back and look at chapter 1 just to make sure that this is the same character that I'm thinking about. So one of the things that Mehlos does is she does interweave certain characters and situations within and among the various books or chapters, the different towns that both John Henry Hunter and Vane Black go to. Now, I do appreciate the structure of this webcomic, right, where each successive chapter or book is the next town that they go to. And there's something kind of predictable in a nice way about the way that the story moves along, right? Vane Black is pursuing John Henry Hunter. John Henry Hunter is trying to get away. I think other than trying to get away and to do his own thing, I can't really discern much of a reason why John Henry Hunter does what he does and goes where he goes. In other words, there doesn't seem to be some kind of larger plan that Hunter has in mind. Could you discern something?
No, I couldn't either. It seems to me that he's almost kind of like a Lone Ranger kind of character, in that he just kind of wanders around and does his thing, and each week or each installment or whatever, he gets to a new episode and does his thing there and goes on and moves to the next episode. And I think it's set up kind of along that same line as like a Lone Ranger serial or something like that.
And that's interesting that you say that. On the other hand, though, the Lone Ranger did have some kind of ultimate goal, and that is to fight crime. Now, he was a vigilante, but he nonetheless was a crime fighter, and so that was a larger goal for him. Now, Vane Black has a larger goal, right, to catch up with and take care of, however you define that, John Henry Hunter. But with Hunter, I don't know why he does what he does. And you could argue that, he's not only a magician, but he's also very good with cards. He may be a bit of a con man to take advantage of people. However, there are certain chapters or sections of this webcomic that are more humanizing when it comes to John Henry Hunter than otherwise. And I'm thinking in particular of, I know Diamondback Ridge is one such section where you do see a more human side to him, where he does care for people. And I think that there are a couple of other earlier chapters where you do see him in a much more positive light, and Vane Black in a more negative light. And so if one were to argue, well, he just goes from town to town not only to get away from Vane Black, but also to take advantage of people, I would say, no, he doesn't really take advantage of everyone that he meets. And in fact, he even puts himself in danger of being caught by Black by caring for certain people like he does.
Yeah, I think we get, although I think we do get a little bit of a sense, and I'm trying to remember what chapter that was, where he's not only he's doing this wandering around, but as much of being a con man, just getting by, and as much being a performer. Mm-hmm. And we get hints of that from the flashbacks that he used to be a noted stage magician, and there's a kid he encounters at one point who says, "Oh, hey, I've got your poster," and instead of the wanted poster, he pulls up one of these old magician flyers or whatever. But there's also in that instance where he picks up that weird gadget that picks out or is able to find certain minerals. I forget which chapter that was.
I think that's Broken Sky, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, that was Broken Sky. Yes. So and he puts that on as a show, right? So he's up there doing a performance, and it's not quite card tricks and cut a lady in half type of performance, but he's still utilizing that same skill. So I'm wondering if that's me. He's just going from town to town trying to get what he can, and just that's his way of just getting by instead of setting up a farm and doing crops or livestock or what have you. His gimmick is performance, and back in the day that meant you went to a town, you did a performance, and then you went on to the next town,
right?
And another performance.
An itinerant performer.
Yeah. So I get the sense that that's they kind of allude to that here, that's kind of what he's doing. Although, yeah, it's I don't think ever made explicit at any point.
Right. Now, I think this gets to a larger issue I have with Next Town Over. And let me preface what I'm about to say by first saying I like Next Town Over, and especially Mehlos' art. I think that her art is the standout. I think among all three of, and I don't want to get to where we're comparing one creator to another in terms of, ooh, this person has better art. But I'll just tell you, a subjective response is, of the three webcomics that we're discussing this month, Next Town Over, Mehlos' art is the one that really stands out to me. I mean, I think that the art of Milton and the art of whom we're about to discuss, Megan Rose Gedris, also does some really good stuff, but I was really bowled over by Mehlos' art in Next Town Over. And I think that it's a fascinating premise, okay? So it's not just the art that I liked about this. My issue, though, with Next Town Over is that, okay, this began in October of 2010, and we see in the notes every now and again that follow the various pages. And I think this is a webcomic that's only updated, or at least supposedly once a week, so it's not a 2 or 3 times a week deal. And there have been times when Erin Mehlos has had life issues come up, and she tells us in the notes, sorry I haven't been around for a while, but, the birth of our first child, or we had some illness in the family, or whatever the case was, right? So these things happen, I understand. But it's been a little over 7 years since we've had Next Town Over. By this point, you would have thought that we would know a lot more about, for example, John Henry Hunter and why he is going from town to town as he is. In other words, what kind of motive does he have in going from town to town outside of just getting away from Vane Black? Even more significant, I think, is a big question mark about the relationship between Vane Black and John Henry Hunter. In the first 2 or 3 sections or chapters, I was okay with little bits of information we were being teased with here or there, and I thought that this was to Mehlos' narrative strength, right? She doesn't throw everything out to us at once about the past between Vane Black and John Henry Hunter, we're given certain clues, and sometimes those clues are only visual, right? There's no text involved, and I really appreciated that. But by the time we got to book 5, book 6, book 7, book 8, book 9, and there's still all of these question marks, 7 years, a little more than 7 years after Next Town Over began, that is decompressing things a little too much, I think. At least I felt as a reader. In other words, 7 years in, we're into book 9. I would like to know a little bit more about Vane Black and John Henry Hunter's relationship. Quit teasing. Give me a little more substance.
I think that's a fair criticism, I think. I'm trying to think, as I actually started reading this at least 3 or 4 years ago, possibly longer. And it's been one of those where I go through spurts with it. I'll sit down and I'll read through a chapter or two, and then I won't look at it for a year. And then I'll come back and, she's completed another chapter or two at that point, and I'll read through all that. And so sitting down and reading through it like that, it didn't really bother me. I did notice, I guess it kind of didn't seem like I was reading it for as long as I was. Although I can see that if you're sitting down reading it on a week-to-week basis, I could see where that would be annoying. Mm-hmm. And I could see that also being frustrating if you sit down and read it all at once and you're like, well, wait a minute, here we're 10 books in and still don't know this, that, and the other. I could see that being frustrating as well. But because of the way I've read this over the years, it's kind of like, I honestly, you know what? Going back to my Lone Ranger analogy, it's kind of like visiting a serial that, you sit down and you watch a couple of weeks and you're like, oh, hey, that was a great adventure. And then if there's no follow-up 2 years later, it's not a big deal. You still go back and watch it. No, hey, it's another great adventure. It's almost more of a kind of a pulpy style to it, I guess. Mm-hmm. And because I've read it like that, and not intentionally, that's not what I didn't set out to read it like that, but that's how it ended up. That hasn't really bothered me. I totally see where you're coming from, but right. Because of how I read that, it didn't really hit me like that as well.
And, this is something that I don't think we mention often on the webcomic series, but how readers resonate with a particular webcomic can have everything to do with how or for how long they've been consuming the webcomic. So more times than not, when we discuss something on the webcomic series, it's a title that you have recommended because you're much more aware of the webcomics world than I am. And so some of these titles, like Next Town Over, you've been reading for at least a couple of years, if not from the very beginning of a particular webcomics, origins. And so you may read it in a rhythm that's completely different from the way I read it, because I didn't even know about Next Town Over until you recommended that we discuss it in February. And it was only then that I went through and I read it from beginning to end. And so the means or the manner in which I consumed it or read everything was very different from your experience. And so getting everything at once is very different from getting things over a period of months or even years.
Yeah, and it's a notion I've thought about even with regard to print comics for many years too. And the analogy I like to make is, or that I have made, I don't know that I like to make it, but I have made this analogy before, is there anyone reading comics today that has really read the original Galactus trilogy? Right, from way back in the day, right? The Fantastic Four meet Galactus for the first time. There's that 3 issues. They aren't able to beat him physically. Reed Richards, with the help of the Watcher, is able to get the Ultimate Nullifier, send him away. Right? You've read that story, right? I've read that story. I've read that story a dozen times. Most people have only read it in reprints, though. Right? They've only read the updated version that was recolored and doesn't have Galactus in shorts because his legs were in the original were colored pink because they were colored like he was wearing shorts and not long pants, which is one thing. But then here's the other issue: even if you do have those original issues, and sit down to read them, and see the original ads, see the original coloring, see the original printer errors that the misregistration or whatever, we still have 50 years of context since that happened. The people who read this back in whatever it was, 65 or thereabouts, there was a very distinct mindset as you were reading that coming off the newsstand, right? Walt Disney had just died. Martin Luther King had not been killed yet. But the civil rights issue was, very much in the news in a very different way than it is today. There's an entirely different context and notion of what you're responding to because of the world around you. So, which is a long way of saying that no two people are going to read a webcomic even in the same way, right? Whether
right.
You like me, I've read it a little bit in bits and pieces over the years. There are other people who've read it religiously every week without fail. People like you who've read a whole bunch of it in one batch. There are people who haven't read the webcomic version at all but bought a printed copy, right? And that's going to be a totally different reading experience. So I don't know that any one of them is necessarily bad or worse than any of the others. They're just all different. And I think it's very interesting, an interesting way to look at and think about from a creator's perspective, how your viewers, how your audience is interacting with your comic.
Right. Along with this is, I guess, another, and I don't want to call it a criticism because, I did say that I do like Next Town Over. So I guess it is criticism, but not criticism with a capital C. In other words, I'm not bashing Next Town Over and Mehlos for what she's doing with this. Again, I think, as you're pointing out, as we're discussing now, much of it, in my experience and my reaction, has to do with the manner in which I've been reading Next Town Over. And I think this is what I'm about to say, also a function of that. And that is, and we discussed this last month, and I can't remember which webcomic it was, but I'm not the biggest fan of a webcomic creator interspersing her or his main storyline with fan art and fan-created stories. Mm-hmm. I understand why creators do that in webcomics, and I have nothing against it. It's just, it disrupts my reading experience. But again, if I'm reading a webcomic, like sitting down over a day or two or three, in other words, a relatively concentrated period of time, and trying to read for the main storyline, then seeing these side stories by people who are not even the creator, but their stories inspired by what the creator's been doing with the main webcomic, that disrupts the reading process for me if I'm trying to get the main story that's going on in the webcomic. We do get quite a bit of that in Next Town Over. Now, granted, one of the things that Mehlos does is she's also creating a series of stories that she titled Poor Wayfaring Strangers, and collecting those as a series of short stories that's based in this same world that Next Town Over is, but they don't necessarily have anything to do with the main storyline. They may include some of the same characters or references, but these stories as a whole are completely separate from Next Town Over. Mm-hmm. So when the various fan art or side stories are interspersed with Next Town Over, that disrupts things for me. But again, it's the way I'm reading. If I were reading this on a week-by-week basis, I don't think that would bother me at all. And I also understand why Mehlos has done what she's done in terms of interspersing other stories with her main storyline, Next Town Over, because there are times that she is not able to keep up with the story because, again, life gets in the way. And so she relies on these other stories that people contribute, which is fine. But again, that kind of disrupts the main consumption of Next Town Over, but it's the way that I read that, which is very different from the way that other people like you read Next Town Over.
Yeah, and I think there's arguments on both sides of that for exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
I have heard, even within webcomic creators, I've heard some creators say, I need to have some content out there without fail every week or whatever their schedule is, every 3 days or something. And if my readers don't see something, then the argument is, and it's a justifiable one, is they will go elsewhere.
Right. They may lose interest.
Right. The flip side to that, and I've heard other webcomic creators say this exactly, is that they're coming to the website to read my work. And if I'm presenting somebody else's work, that's a disservice to my readers, because that's not what they came here for. They came to read not necessarily the comic about, John Henry Hunter or whatever. They came here to read my story specifically. And if I'm presenting even something within the same universe, even in, the same style or similar style, same tone, what have you, but from a different creator, that's not what they're coming here for. So you're doing a disservice to the readers by presenting something that's less than what it could be.
Right.
And doubly, the double argument to that is you can't win in that situation because, A, if the guest artist isn't as good as an artist, good being a relative term, of course, but if the guest artist isn't as good as your regular stuff, then they feel like they're additionally getting gypped. Is not only am I not getting the creator I came for, but I'm getting a worse creator. On the flip side, if the artist is a better artist than you are, then they can come then the audience can come and look at this and say, well, what the hell am I wasting time on this guy for? On the old guy, I'll go to this new guy's webcomic because this stuff is a lot better. So the argument there is that there's a no-win situation. I don't, honestly, I think it depends on each individual creator and the type of story they're telling and the type of relationship they have with an audience. And again, that's not going to be the same for each and every audience member, each and every reader. It's going to be approaching like we've been talking about. Everybody's going to be coming to this a little bit differently. And you kind of have to look at what's the best approach for the largest majority of my core audience, or my substantive audience, I should say, is not necessarily the people who come the most often, but the people who contribute the most to my well-being as a comic book artist, whether through a PayPal donation or a Patreon account or a Kickstarter or what have you. Those are the people. It's a business. You have to listen to the people paying the bills, basically, is what it amounts to. Right.
Now, I know we need to move on to the next webcomic that we're going to be discussing this month. But before we leave Next Town Over, I want to say a couple things about the design of this website. I think that this is very well done. I mentioned being a big fan of Mehlos' art in Next Town Over, and I think that her sense of design and not just visually, but also in terms of navigability is really up there, right? It's a really strong point of this webcomic because there's an about page that I think is substantive enough. There's a contact page. The archive page, I think, is very navigable. There's a series of links where she sells things, interestingly enough and appropriately enough. It's called the General Store. She also has forums that she set up and a news blog that kind of supplements what is going on with Next Town Over, the storyline. I like it. I think it's really well done. Now, I don't think that there are any print versions of Next Town Over, but Mehlos does sell both CBZ and PDF versions of what you could read on the web. So if you're someone who would rather not have internet access as you read through Next Town Over, then for just $1, you can buy a chapter or a book And this goes up to, I think, the first 8 because 9 is still ongoing. But you can also get PDF or CBZ versions of some of the other stuff that she's done. There is, the aforementioned Poor Wayfaring Strangers. Why can't I say wayfaring? I don't know. Poor Wayfaring Strangers. But there's also another story called Trail Dust that is based in this world, or early sketches at least as well. So, this is a creator who seems to primarily work in the digital medium, and at least when it comes to Next Town Over and the various narratives that are a part of this universe, there are no print versions. So
actually there are, though.
There are?
Yes. You kind of have to click through a couple
dry goods. Oh, it says Next Town Over dry goods. So I bet you that is where the comics are.
If you click through to her store, Envy store.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, that's where she's got some of the. She doesn't have individual issues, but she has collected editions. Right. A few of those available.
Yes. Okay, I do see those now. I guess I just didn't click through to the dry goods store section in order to see that. But yeah, these are in her store Envy shop. So cool. As well as things like T-shirts and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Sean, let's go to the last webcomic that we're discussing for the month of February, and this is the already completed webcomic, You+Me Dream. This is by Megan Rose Getris, otherwise known as Rosalarian. And, I'm wondering if the name Rosalarian is a name that Getris primarily uses for her webcomics, because I know that she goes by the name Megan Getris in a print comic that she's currently doing for Oni Press, Spectacle. In fact, have you read or looked at Spectacle?
I have not seen it yet, no. I suspect that has to do with just a maturity on her level, because when she started You+Me Dream, she was, I believe, just out of high school. Mm-hmm. So I think there was more of a concern of, internet trolls coming in and causing all sorts of havoc and whatever when she first started, and she used the Rosalarian as kind of the firewall of sorts to kind of keep some of that off. As she got older, as she got more experienced, as she got more comfortable, as she got more professional, she was sort of dropping that in favor of her actual name.
Right. And I definitely want to talk about the growth and maturity as it relates to You+Me Dream. But first, let's mention that listeners can find this at yume.rosalarian.com. And that is yume.rosalarian, rosalarian.com. And as we mentioned, this is an already completed webcomic. This ran from June of 2004 and ended in November 2010. So this has been completed for quite a while. And in fact, there have been print editions of the various volumes of You+Me Dream. And this is by far not the only thing that Getris has done. I mentioned that she's currently doing a series for Oni called Spectacle, but she's also known for the webcomic Lesbian Pirates from Outer Space, Meaty Yogurt, and one that I think appears on a rather risque site called Filthy Figments, and in fact is something maybe we should look into. It's called Darlin', It's Betta Down Where It's Wetta. And that's the way it sounds, Betta and Wetta. That's the way it's spelled.
I think, honestly, you know what? I think that's the only one of her comics I have not read yet. I think I have every one of the other ones in some format. I've read the other ones in some format.
Yeah, well, I went there to look at it, and then I saw the site that it's on called Filthy Figments, and it seems to be a collection of webcomics that are on the sexually explicit side, which I have nothing against. I just point that out as an observation.
Sure. But that's not what we're talking about today.
That's right. We're talking about this, I guess, a rather long webcomic called You+Me Dream. And it deals with, I guess, primarily, we have two main characters. There is Fiona, and then her, I guess we could call love interest, friend and love interest, Leah. But there are other characters as well. This is a webcomic that is in two parts. Part 1 is made up of 9 issues, and part 2 is made up of 14. Sean, before we go any further, let's go ahead and mention to our listeners something that you and I were trying to decide how we would deal with before we turned the mics on today. There are certain things about You+Me Dream, especially in the second part, that we can't say, or we can't say much in detail about, because we would be spoiling the webcomic if we did. Mm-hmm. Which in many ways is ironic and a shame, because for me, at least in terms of my experience reading You+Me Dream, things really get exciting, significantly so in the second part as compared to what was going on in the first part. And I think that's where a lot of the innovation of You+Me Dream comes into play, is the second part. But we can't say much about what goes on in part 2, because if we do, we'll spoil it. We really will.
Yeah, it's really an interesting setup. The entire story is an interesting setup. It's basically it's essentially a love story between Fiona and Leah, and a lot of the first part is the setup to that, them getting to know each other. The first as friends, then as lovers, and the issues that are surrounding in that. The typical kind of high school students and parents who don't understand them, and other students who make fun of them for a variety of reasons, bullying, all of that kind of I don't want to say typical, but more or less daily drama that a lot of LGBTQ people have to deal with. So there's an interesting setup there. But then that second half it gets a lot more experimental in a variety of ways. It still maintains that love story, and the whole point of the story is basically for Leah and Fiona to get together, which happily they do at the end. But the types of challenges and the type of obstacles that they start running into for that second half are really of a different kind. And it's like you said, it's hard to get into to detailing that without kind of spoiling how they change, and it's a significant and interesting twist between the two chapters, or the two sections there, of how they goes from one to the other. And I think it'd be wrong of us to kind of say too much about what that twist is and how that works, without truly spoiling it for the audience here.
Exactly. But I think we can safely say that what we're trying to step lightly around has everything to do with the word dream in the title. Because you find out from the very beginning, from the first issue in part 1, that Fiona is someone who in many ways prefers to be asleep dreaming than living the life that she has, because as she tells us in the first issue, everybody seems to hate her or have something against her, but when she's asleep and when she's dreaming, things seem to go her way. She fits in. And at least in the first part, that understanding of her within the context of dreaming makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But then the whole idea of dreams, dreaming, what it means to go from the quote-unquote real world into the dream world, or what was the dream world and what is the dream world, becomes much more complicated and I think much more interesting as we get into the second part of You+Me Dream. But again, you and I really can't say much about the second part and in much detail because it'll be giving things away, and we don't want to spoil it.
Yeah. But that being said, the first part is very good in and of itself. Mm-hmm. In fact, if you wanted to, with the exception of maybe the last 3 or 4 pages or something, you could almost read that first part as a standalone piece. And like I said, with the exception of the last 3 or 4 pages, it's almost a complete book in and of itself. And it's a very good story of, like I said, Leah and Fiona kind of meeting, getting to know one another, dealing with all of the garbage that they have to deal with as lovers. And it's a very touching story, I think. Mm-hmm. Even just that first part of it. And there's a lot of good characterization, a lot of good storytelling, I think, going on. And there's I honestly got to the end of that first part, and I was compelled. I was like, oh wow, this is really good stuff, and wanted to keep reading. I wouldn't have no problems whatsoever if Gedris had done the second half in the same vein as the first. I'd have been completely fine with that. I think what she's done is very different, and it's not better or worse necessarily, but if she had done the entire thing in the same format as the first part, I'd have thought that was still a very good book, a very good story overall. I
agree. I think that if we had ended soon before part 1 ends, right? So as you pointed out, if we discount the last few issues, the last few pages of part 1, let's say when Fiona actually does arrive to the prom, then part 1 could be a standalone narrative that would have a satisfactory ending. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you go to the archive page, which again I think is laid out pretty well, and you can at least quickly navigate between issue numbers in part 1 and then part 2, going to pages within each issue is, I don't think, an option, but it can get you where you want to go. Each issue is not that long. I guess it's like, a comic book issue, a print comic book issue, something to that extent. But if you go to the archive and you see that there is a brief description of what goes on in each of the issues. So in issue 1, meet Fiona, a dreamer. Issue 2, a new girl named Leah shows up at school. I mean, that's basically how things are set up. On issue 9 in part 1, and this is the last issue, Richard, and we can talk about him at some point if you want, shows up. He's someone from Fiona's mother's past. So Richard shows up, Fiona goes to prom, and then, and this is in all caps, this last statement, everything goes insane. And so it's in those final pages of part 1 where things go insane that complicates everything that we had just been reading previously in part 1 that we can't really talk about because we'll be giving things away. But I agree. I do think that part 1, for the most part, could stand alone as its own narrative. And that has me wondering, and I'm sure that Gedris has given interviews where she has answered this question that I have. I just haven't read them. I'm not aware of them. But it would be interesting to know if where You+Me Dream ends up or where it transitions from part 1 and part 2. Was this something that Gedris had planned from the very beginning, or is it a narrative move that evolved along the way? In other words, she started someplace, not entirely sure where her webcomic would take her. Then she started to grow as an artist and realized there's more that she could do with this story, and then decided to take it into a radically different arena. In other words, the everything goes insane part that we get on the archive summary. I'd be curious to know.
Actually, she does answer that, or she has answered that. I've got the first place. I did not actually read this originally as a webcomic. I have the printed volumes, okay. two monster volumes here she's got for this. And she includes several extras in the book, including notes at the end of each chapter and saying, here's what I was working on, here's what I was thinking, that kind of business. And in one of them, which I can't seem to find at the moment, she does in fact say that was pretty much how she planned it from day one.
So she pretty much knew where she was going in making this radical move with part 2?
Yeah, that was in the game plan from the start. And she had said she had worked out at some point. She said she had worked out the ending of the final ending. She had worked that out almost from jump, and she was actually felt like she was racing through the last several chapters because she was so eager to get to that, because she had been waiting on that for so long, and she was eager to actually sit down and draw that sequence or those sequences. So yeah, she said, and at some point she says, I think she also references too, she had been working on the story for, I think she said, a year or two before she even started as a webcomic. Not actually, I don't think actually sitting down and drawing individual pages, but working out the plot points and the story beats and that kind of thing. So yeah, this was, I'm sure she didn't have all the details nailed down when she launched the webcomic originally. But she had an idea of what she wanted to do and the direction she wanted to take this well early on in the whole process.
Well, that's interesting. So that's an advantage that you have with the print versions that you own that I didn't have in terms of seeing this and reading it through the webcomic. Huh.
Yeah, I could see that being, if you were reading this as a webcomic as she was posting it, it would seem like a radical departure. I was like, wait, did she just change direction for no apparent reason or something to that effect? But no, this was all there from the start, at least according to her notes in her book. I don't know, maybe she'd written all that afterwards, so maybe she's revising her own history a little bit here, but I kind of doubt it. But
well, another reason why I was wondering if this is a narrative trajectory that evolved over time. In other words, she didn't know ahead of time, let's say in the first several issues where she was starting, where she would eventually end up. I ask this, or I wonder about this also because of the art evolution and what I mean by that. And I think you can see this if you just limit yourself to the first part and don't even think about part 2. One of the things that struck me about You+Me Dream is the growth of Gedris as an artist. And as you pointed out, when she first started You+Me Dream, she was very young. Mm-hmm. And young not only in terms of age, but also I would assume as an artist. The story throughout, from the first issue to the very last one in part 2, I think is compelling. My personal, and this is where personal taste comes in, I wasn't that taken by the art style in the first, let's say, half of part 1 as I was with the rest of it. And for this reason, it struck me as too derivative of manga. Now, what I mean by this is there are occasions, and not just here, but also in a variety of manga titles, where you will have in certain parts of the story more realistic looking, more detailed art, but then when a character is handled in a different way, for instance, maybe from a distance or at a moment of emotional intensity, right? They're excited or they're overly happy or they're crying. They're shown in much less detail, iconic, cartoony fashions. And with manga, many times that's with large gaping mouths and big wide eyes. Mm-hmm. And I see that in a lot of manga. It doesn't bother me much when it comes to manga. Where it does seem to bother me as a reader of comics is when, and I think it's primarily younger creators because they're the ones who grew up in the age of manga, right? And so they're largely influenced by it. because it's so prevalent, right? Over the past 10, 15 years, that's primarily what you find in Barnes and Nobles, right? In Borders
sure.
before they closed down. But it's an art style that's definitely unambiguously influenced by manga. And the early parts of You&Me Dream, you can see this, and that's what I mean by derivative. You know, it's not a deal breaker with me, but it just struck me as a young artist is learning her trade, and she's trying to find her own visual voice. It's not until we get to the last third of part 1 that I think we get a sense of who Megan Gedris is as an artist, not so much as a storyteller, because I think that the storyteller part is there almost from the beginning, but her art develops over time. And then by the time we get into part 2, not only does she become a better artist and is that much more apparent, but she also is much, much more visually experimental and exciting as a creator.
Yeah, and she actually references that also in the books as well. She
growth
says,
as an artist?
Her growth as an artist, yeah. She says, at one point she says, I started drawing this right out of high school or shortly after I got out of high school. And you can see, she actually says, you can see the art style change as the story progresses. And she expressly says that is due to art classes. It's just like, I was taking art classes and that shows in my comics, and you can see that progression as she's going forward. And I think you're absolutely right in that too. As I'm sitting here flipping through it, and one of the other things I even noticed is a change in, obviously the illustration style change, and then improves. She gets better at anatomy and better at facial expressions and that.
And less reliant on manga conventions. And
less reliant on a lot of the stereotypical manga conventions, absolutely. But then one of the things I also noted, too, is when she starts getting into that more experimental stuff where she's bringing in she does a piece with, just vector art instead of illustration. And she does another section that's photographs of little clay figures instead, right? And which all makes sense within the story and the context of the story. But one of the things I also noticed is she changes the lettering that she does as well. And the lettering even becomes more nuanced and more practiced and more not as flat and uninteresting as it is in the first chapters. The first ones are she basically takes a kind of comic book style font and types it out, and everything is the same. As we get into later chapters, particularly in part 2, she starts getting into a lot more hand-drawn lettering, a lot more variety of fonts that get used when she does rely on fonts, and they always make sense for the context. Again, she changes for story reasons. She does change the context and the formatting a bit, whether she's using an illustration or vector art or what have you. And she starts experimenting more with the lettering even as well, which I think is, that second part is much more easier to read just based on the lettering alone,
right?
Than the first part. It's the first half isn't in Comic Sans, but it's not a whole lot improved over that, whatever font she was using.
Yeah. It is amazing the evolution of the art style from the very beginning into part 2 and then to the end of this webcomic. And again, that's an advantage that you have with the print version over me with only the web, because I could only speculate about her growth as an artist, but she comes right out and says art classes really helped. And it's funny because I knew about Spectacle, that Oni Press recent series that I mentioned earlier. And in seeing the art in Spectacle, I was familiar with that before I read the first pages of You&Me Dream. And then when I read those early installments of You&Me Dream, I thought, wait a minute now. This is definitely not the same person who is currently doing Spectacle for Oni Press. But again,
Right.
I mean, she's definitely grown as an artist. So, I mean, that's impressive. But, you know, if the only thing you're going by, for instance, if our listeners are just picking up on this episode right now and are wondering, oh, you know, I've got to check out You+Me Dream, and they go to youme.rosalarian.com and they read the first 3, 4, 5 issues and then says, I don't like this, you know, then they're not giving it a fair shake. You know, stick with it. And if you don't particularly like the heavily manga influenced style of this young creator, then read on issue 5, 6, 7, and then definitely into part 2. It's a very different experience.
Yeah, well, I think, and it makes, even if she hadn't taken the art classes, I think you'd still see a definite evolution just by the fact that she worked on this for over a decade.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. And if you're drawing a webcomic, even if you're not taking classes formally and you're not studying, formal lighting techniques and, whatever, just that practice of doing it every day or every other day or whatever her schedule is at the time, over that long of a period, you're bound to get better. And you're bound to find better ways of doing things, improved ways of doing things. And even like the art classes really show, and I think that's why she improved as quickly as she did, certainly at the start. But I think any webcomic, if it's running for a decade plus and you don't see any change in the art style, they're probably not improving as an artist. I don't know if that's probably not a benefit for them necessarily, in my opinion. I think, who was it? I read years ago, there was an artist who said, if anything I look at that was older than 5 years ago doesn't look like crap to me now, I'm not doing what I should be doing as an artist.
Right.
It's like any work that you did as an artist more than 5 years ago should look like garbage in your eyes, regardless of what other people think about it at the time.
Yeah.
So, and I think you would have seen that absolutely, even, like I said, even without the art classes, I'm certain that she would have improved nonetheless, and you'd see a definite change in art style over the entirety of this book.
Right. Now, let me ask you, where did you get your physical copies of You+Me Dream?
That is a good question. I actually don't exactly remember. I've had them for a few years now. They are both actually signed by Gedris.
So you may have gotten them at a con, right?
I don't think I've ever met her, though. I don't recall. It's possible, but I don't think so. I want to say...
Did you kickstart it or help her?
I want to say I got them online, but I don't recall if that was a Kickstarter or I had read some of her other work and said, hey, let me get the rest of this, so I'll just order it. Honestly, I do not remember. But yeah, I've got copies of these and Meaty Yogurt and a few other books. They're all signed, or most of them are signed. I think the Lesbian Pirates one is not, but most of the other ones are signed. So I don't think I ever met her in person. So I'm pretty sure I just ordered a bunch of stuff I'm thinking I probably just ordered a bunch of stuff from her all at once. A couple of years ago.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because in doing a search on Amazon, I see the individual volumes of You+Me Dream, but they're no longer in print. So if you want to get them, you have to go through a third-party seller. And, maybe since she's doing this comic Spectacle for Oni, and this happens with a lot of webcomics creators, especially those who self-publish in print, once they start doing something for a larger press, they get a little more attention, then their books get picked up, they come back into print.
Yeah, or possibly by an entirely different publisher.
Yeah,
because I think all of her stuff, all of like You+Me Dream and Meaty Yogurt and some of those other books, I think those were all self-published.
Yeah, Rosalarian. Right. At least that's the publisher that's listed on Amazon, Rosalarian.
Right.
So she self-publishes.
So she self-published that, but someone like Oni could come in and say, hey, you know what? You want to run this again we'll do a nice hardcover edition or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that'd be a meaty hardcover because it's well over 100 pages.
Yeah, it is.
Or 800, 800, yeah.
It would be a monster book if you tried to do this all at once. These are the two trade paperback versions that I've got are definitely a good paperweight in the first place. I think they're just, I don't have a scale in front of me, but they're heavy.
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm looking at the Amazon site for one of her books right now, and under the author bio section, I'm reading something really interesting. When not making comics, she, Megan Rose Gedris, performs burlesque around the United States as the comic stripper Florence of Arabia. Okay, now I'm definitely interested in discovering more about this creator. I mean, that's a great sense of humor.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
And the fact that she does burlesque, and I'm a fan of that.
Yeah, I've not seen her perform, I got to say, but I would be curious to see that. That'd be an interesting show. Maybe get her and Erica Moen to do a pole dancing routine or something. I could see a whole performance piece going on at a convention. Get a couple of other creators along those lines.
If I'm not mistaken,
that could be really interesting.
I think that Moen is published through Oni as well.
I think some of her stuff, maybe so.
And that's a relatively recent phenomena, if I'm not mistaken. But
yeah.
Well, Sean, 3 really interesting webcomics that we looked at this February. We started with The Flying Ship by Jess Milton. After that, we looked at Erin Mehlos' Next Town Over. And then we followed up with Megan Rose Gedris's, or Rosalarian's, You+Me Dream. And it didn't strike me until we actually sat down to record this episode that all of the creators that we've discussed this month are women. And we didn't plan it that way. It's just the way it happened. We just decided what titles we wanted without any consideration as to, I don't know, gender, geography, ethnicity, or anything.
Sometimes it just works out like that. There's a lot of good stuff out there, and this is proof of that, I think. Yeah.
I had a fun time reading and preparing for this particular episode. But then again, every month I have a good time preparing for our webcomic shows.
Same here.
And if you want to find great titles that are very similar to the kind that Sean and I discuss every month on the webcomic series, then definitely go to the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. That's dcbservice.com. And remember, if you like your comics fair digitally, then visit their sister company, mydigitalcomics.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you've got some comics you'd like us to review for maybe a future episode and would prefer to not try and spell out the long, drawn-out URL on a phone line or something like that, you can send us a handy email. You can email us both at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. That's TWOGUIS. Or you can email me directly at Sean, SEAN, @comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and we have a Slack channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
All the great material there, plus all of the back issue stuff that you get to listen to all our previous shows if you haven't already.
That's right. And we will be back next month with more webcomic goodness. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Sean. We'll see you next month.